Hello, class. The last time we met, we talked about Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics and how virtue is essential to happiness. And we saw Aristotle divide virtue into moral virtue and intellectual virtue. In Book 2, Aristotle covers the topic of moral virtue. And he begins with the observation that we are not born virtuous. We're not born vicious either. Instead, we are born with potential. Isn't it interesting that of all the creatures born on this earth, human beings are the ones that are born with the fewest instincts? Not that we don't have any instincts, but compared to other animals, we have relatively few instincts. A turtle is born, he doesn't even need the tutelage of his parents. He just knows exactly what a turtle needs to do in order to be a turtle. Not so with human beings. We are not born with a tidy sum of programming. We are born with, instead, potential. We are a raw lump of clay, and that raw lump can be molded either for better or for worse. So for Aristotle, we start with the fact that we have potential. The word he uses is a little more technical, potency. And the goal is to convert that potency into something real, to convert it into something actual and not just potential. So how do you convert your potential into something real? Let me ask you this. How do you become a great athlete? Now, some people would say, oh, so-and-so was a great athlete. He was born that way. Yeah, maybe. Maybe he was born with certain natural aptitudes. But to become a great athlete, every athlete needs to do exactly the same thing. Practice. Practice, practice, practice. And what does practice consist of? Repeated acts. The same acts over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until those acts become second nature. Have you ever played basketball? Have you ever had that sensation the first time? Do you remember this? The first time you held a basketball and how big and unwieldy it was, and you had to be taught where to put your hand on the ball and where to put your elbow and where to put the other shoulder. You probably think this is weird, but I'm left-handed, so humor me. And that when the ball released from your hand, it had to go off the fingers in a certain way, and it was very awkward. But you kept doing it. You kept doing it, you kept doing it until it became second nature. And then when you become a great athlete, you're playing a game, you get the ball, you aim, you shoot. You don't even think about, oh, where was my finger? Where was my elbow? It has entered into your system, and you no longer need to give it any thought. It has become second nature. When you have repeated acts so many times that they seem to be a part of you, they have passed from mere acts to habits. They have become a deeply ingrained habit. And we call good habits virtues, bad habits vices. Interestingly enough, virtues and vices are not acts, they are habits. They are predispositions to act a certain way. And so the goal, obviously, is to acquire as many good habits as possible and to avoid as many bad habits as possible. And the way you do that is by performing only good acts again and again and again, and not performing bad acts so often that they become habitual. These habits are very important because whether they're good habits or bad habits, they are what will shape your character. And that word character in English is a very interesting word. It comes from the Greek word for engraining, for etching. Your character is what you have etched onto your soul. It is what you have ingrained into your soul through the repeated acts that form habits. because the repeated acts that form habits are like drops of water on a stone. One little drop isn't going to change the stone at all. But what happens if that one little drop keeps hitting the stone in the same spot for 1,000,000 years? What happens? You could form a great cavern, a stalagmites, stalactites. It's amazing just the power of consistency in grooving and changing even hard material. Your habits groove ruts into your soul. Now, if they're good habits, that's okay. No one complains about being in a good rut. But when they're bad habits, you get into a rut and it's hard to get out. Your character is what you have written onto your soul. Your character, therefore, is your responsibility. There's a big difference between personality and character. Personality is essentially what you're born with. Certain likes, certain dislikes, certain capacities. They say that whether you're naturally shy or naturally extroverted could go right back to your genetic makeup, to the moment you were born. But you were not born with character. You may be born with a certain kind of personality, but you're not born with character. Character is the result of your choice. And it is an extremely important thing because it is your character, more than anything else in this life, that will determine whether you will be happy or not. Not what horoscope you have, not your parents or your family, not your wealth, not your luck. It is character that will determine whether you are going to be happy or not. There is an outstanding poem by the British novelist William Thackeray. It's a very short little poem, and it goes like this. Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. Your character determines your destiny. Not an alignment of stars, not fortune or misfortune. Isn't that fascinating? It is your character that shapes your destiny. All right. Hopefully you've been convinced that moral virtue is the way to go, that your character is your destiny. It is vitally important that you work on character building every day of your life. Don't just be a couch potato. Don't just glide through life. Work on making your soul excellent. Work on making your life a work of art. That is basically what this is all about. So, that said, what else do we need to know about moral virtue? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Aristotle has very fascinating things to say about moral virtue. The first thing he notes is that it is a mean that always falls between two extremes. And the two extremes are some kind of deficiency on the one hand and an excess on the other. And virtue falls somewhere in between. Both of these are vices. The deficiency is a vice, the excess is a vice, and the virtue is somewhere in between. But it's not smack dab in the middle. Interestingly enough, it is not an arithmetic mean that is equidistant between the two extremes. It always leans towards one side or the other. Remember, this is the science of ethics. It has its own degree of precision, and this is just the way things are. So, for example, in the category of confidence in the face of adversity, the deficient reaction is the vice known as cowardice. The excess is the vice known as rashness. Courage is the right amount of confidence in the face of adversity. Where do you think it falls? Do you think the courageous man has more in common with the coward or with the rash man? Probably the rash man. Rashness is a vice, but the courageous man and the rash man probably have more in common with each other than with the coward. And I am giving you, somehow, I don't know if I'm going to post this on YouTube or simply email it to you, a list of all the 11 moral virtues that Aristotle discusses in the Nicomachean Ethics. We ourselves aren't going to be able to go into these in detail. Some of them are in books we haven't read. But you'll get a sense of how the virtue will lean towards one or the other. It's not always deficiency, not always excess. And the list is quite charming. I'll give you my personal favorite, humor. Aristotle says there is a deficiency and an extreme or an excess regarding humor. If you don't have enough humor, you are a bore and guilty of the vice of boorishness. But if you have too much humor, you are a buffoon and guilty of buffoonery. But if you got just the right amount of humor, you have wit. You are a witty human being. What side do you think wit leans more towards? More towards the deficiency of boorishness or the excess of buffoonery? That's a tough call. Aristotle doesn't always tell us which way it leans. Maybe a bore? Like a dry wit? I don't know. So, 3 things to know about Aristotle's moral virtue. Number 1, it is a mean. Number 2, it is a mean that is relative to us. Or to use our language from an earlier lecture, it is quod nos. That simply means it's not a mean that exists in and of itself. It's a mean that only exists in relation to the moral agent. Because the mean is not the same for everyone. Take food, for example, moderation. What is the moderate amount of food? Well, the answer is, it depends. A tiny little old lady and a giant football player are going to eat vastly different amounts of food, and that's okay. It's not that the football player is being gluttonous. What is a moderate amount of food for him is going to be different than what's a moderate amount of food for a much smaller person. So you have to take into account several characteristics about you. What is your height and weight? What is your rate of metabolism? How much do you exercise? All of these things are important things to know in order to determine the mean quod you, relative to you. Classic example of this is the consumption of alcohol. There is such a thing as drinking in moderation. It would be the virtuous consumption of alcohol, where you're not drinking too much. But how do you know how much is enough? How do you know you're drinking moderately or virtuously? It depends on the circumstances. How tall are you? Are you drinking on an empty stomach or a full stomach? Makes a big difference. If you're drinking on an empty stomach, that alcohol is going to pass through your stomach membranes into your bloodstream a lot faster. Carbonated alcohol drinks actually also intoxicate more quickly because there's something about the bubbles that allow the alcohol to pass through your tissue more quickly, or so I've been told. Are you male or female? Women tend to have a higher percentage of body fat, and alcohol passes through fatty tissue faster than it does muscle tissue, which is why women are more susceptible to intoxication than men. Am I tired? Am I in a jacuzzi? Believe it or not, that makes a difference. If jacuzzis dehydrate, and if you're dehydrated, you're going to get intoxicated more quickly. All of these are factors that you need to know in order to know what the mean is in your particular situation. It is a mean, and it is a mean that is relative to us, the moral agent. Notice this doesn't mean that everything is relative. When I say relative, I don't mean relativism. Oh, there's no such thing as right or wrong, good or evil. That's not what he's talking about. He's simply saying moral virtue is real, but the only way to know how you are being virtuous is to size the situation up vis-a-vis your own circumstances. Last thing we can mention is that moral virtue is a perfection of your emotions. I've pretty much already said this, but I just want to drive it home. The basic point is this. It's easy to get angry. It's easy to be attracted to somebody. It's easy to be hungry. It's surprisingly difficult to be those things in the right way, to the right degree, for the right reason, in the right circumstances. Both good men and bad men get angry. Both of them experience the emotion of anger. But what's the difference? The good man reacts angrily for the right reasons, to the right degree, and so on and so forth. We all have emotions. Good people and bad people all have emotions. The key is perfecting your emotions. Because if you don't perfect your emotions, they will dominate you. If you don't rule them, they will rule you. And the only way to rule them is through virtue. Cultivate them, train them, habituate them to always have an instinct to hit the mean. That is part of the secret of the good life.